Welcome to Measurement and Research Methods. This course covers exactly what you'd think: how to define and measure behavior, as well as environmental events, and methods for both researching behavior and judging functional relations between behavior and environmental events in applied work as well. First, let's cover the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis, defined by Baer, Wolf, and Risley. Any applied intervention or research project that fails to fulfill one or more of these dimensions is, at best, not applied. For example, in the case of basic experimental research. But it also may simply not be behavior analytic in the first place. The applied characteristic of ABA requires that our interventions and treatments target behaviors that will result in socially significant changes for the individuals we're serving. The term social significance can sometimes be misinterpreted to mean that we target behavioral changes that are considered to be the most socially acceptable. However, the term social significance actually refers to the degree to which the behavioral change we're targeting benefits the individual themselves. For example, consider a 1973 case study presented in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. The parents of a 6-year-old boy with developmental disabilities asked the researchers to create an intervention that would encourage the child to say grace or pray before dinner each night. While this was an important behavior to the parents, the data revealed that on nights the child was required to say grace, he engaged in high rates of unsafe and disruptive behavior. This is an example of an intervention that does not meet the applied dimension of ABA. While the targeted behavioral change was important to the parents, saying grace didn't create any meaningful changes in the child's life. On the contrary, it seemed to result in increased distress. This could be a function of the target behavior itself or the methods by which it was intervened upon. Further investigation would be necessary. The behavioral characteristic of ABA requires that our research and interventions must target change in the actual behavior of interest or importance. This behavior must be measurable and must be emitted by the actual individual for whom the intervention is implemented. Consider the previous example of the intervention on praying behavior. For this study, the researchers observed and measured whether or not the child actually engaged in the praying behavior. They also measured additional behaviors of importance, such as those unsafe and disruptive behaviors they saw. If the researcher instead asked the parents to report if they thought the intervention was working or how satisfied they were with the intervention, this would not meet the behavioral dimension of ABA because the actual behavior of interest, the praying, wasn't measured, and instead the researchers would have been using the parents' behavior, their reported satisfaction, as their indication of effectiveness. For this reason, many measures of behavior change used in psychology, such as self-reports or scores on questionnaires, do not meet the behavioral dimension of ABA. The third dimension of ABA requires that our work be analytic, meaning that we can demonstrate a functional or causal relation between the independent variable and changes in the dependent variable. In our applied work, our independent variable is most often the intervention or treatment we're implementing. The dependent variable is then the behavior we're targeting for change. Not only does a functional relation between our interventions and changes in behaviors demonstrate that the intervention was effective or successful, but it also provides further confirmation of our conceptualization of behavior as a function of environmental manipulations. If we implement an intervention and do not see the predicted corresponding change in behavior, it not only tells us that the intervention was ineffective, but more importantly, gives us information about why the intervention was ineffective, which can then be used to revise and refine your conceptualization of the function of the behavior before attempting to design a new intervention. The technological dimension of ABA refers to the fact that all of our procedures must be completely described with enough detail that someone else could read that intervention or study the procedures and implement it themselves without any further information. Like all other sciences, the believability of our conclusions is based upon others' abilities to replicate our findings, and as such, this requires describing our interventions and procedures in enough detail to allow them to do so. Similarly, clear and objective definitions of behavior allow ourselves and others to more believably collect data on the same targets. Another defining characteristic of ABA is that our interventions and procedures are conceptually systematic. That means that their goals and effects are defined based on basic principles of behavior analysis, such as reinforcement and punishment. We would not, for example, attribute the effectiveness of a sticker chart to improvements in the client's self-esteem or with reference to other cognitive concepts. Instead, we might note that the stickers, when provided contingent upon specific target behaviors, acted as positive reinforcement. Another important characteristic of applied behavior analysis is that it is an empirically validated science that is effective to a socially significant degree. Of course, not all interventions will be immediately effective to these standards. This dimension of ABA requires that we constantly assess the effects of our work, both based on direct effects on behavior and based on input by clients and their significant others, and adjust procedures as necessary. Finally, applied behavior analysis must be generalizable in terms of both its procedures and effects. We must program for generalizability, for example, by implementing interventions across environments and with a variety of stimuli. If the effects of an intervention do not generalize, for example, if behavior changes at home but not at the client's grandmother's house, the intervention was not sufficiently effective, and we must make changes to address this. Now let's get some practice. In each of these examples, think about which of the 7 dimensions of ABA is clearly demonstrated or is lacking. Ron, a man in his 30s, engages in serious aggressive behavior that has resulted in hospital visits for both Ron and those who he has aggressed against. In order to improve his diet, his behavior analyst has suggested that Ron decrease the frequency in which he consumes eggs and implements an antecedent intervention where Ron is no longer purchasing them or keeping them in his home. The intervention is successful, and Ron rarely consumes eggs even when he travels. Which dimension is not being demonstrated in this case? Applied. An inappropriate target behavior was selected based on the urgency of intervening upon the aggression first. To increase the frequency of Tom's positive social behaviors, Lori begins a reinforcement procedure. Each time Lori observes Tom smile wide enough to expose his teeth or laugh for more than 2 seconds, she winks at him. The reinforcement procedure seems to be effective, but only when Lori is around. Which dimension is not being demonstrated? Generalizability. The intervention is only effective when Lori is around. Leslie implements a continuous reinforcement schedule using candy to increase Frank's social behaviors. Social behavior is defined as any time that Frank has a nice attitude toward others and doesn't seem too menacing. Which dimension is not being demonstrated? Behavioral. Social behavior is not operationally defined. It's not objective or measurable. Ben is well respected for his successful behavior management plans for high school students. Steve agrees to fill in until Ben returns from a hiking trip. Steve looks over the behavior plans, but only sees the note, "Show them who's boss." Which dimension is not being demonstrated? Technological. There's not enough information here to replicate the interventions. To increase the frequency of Tom's positive social behaviors, Lori begins a reinforcement procedure. Each time Lori observes Tom smile wide enough to expose his teeth or laugh for more than 2 seconds, she winks at him. Shortly after beginning the intervention, an attractive new student moves into the camp. The reinforcement procedure must be effective because everyone at camp keeps telling Lori that Tom seems nicer. Which dimension is not being demonstrated? Analytic. Since a new student moved into camp at the same time the intervention began, a functional relation may not be present. The change in Tom's behavior may not be because of the specific intervention. To increase the frequency of Tom's positive social behaviors, Lori begins a reinforcement procedure. Each time Lori observes Tom smile wide enough to expose his teeth or laugh for more than 2 seconds, she winks at him. Lori suspects that something must be wrong, since after 4 weeks, Tom hardly smiles or laughs with anyone anymore. Which dimension is not being demonstrated? Effective. The intervention didn't work. Donna implements a 3-hour differential reinforcement schedule of other behavior to decrease the frequency of Jerry's aggressive behavior. Aggressive behavior is defined as any instance where Jerry makes forceful contact with another person, anywhere on their body, using his hand, foot, or head. According to the data, the intervention appears to decrease aggressive behavior. Donna makes it a point to inform others that what she is doing is based on the principles of reinforcement. Which dimension is being demonstrated? Conceptually systematic. Donna describes her procedure in terms of the basic principles of behavior. Now let's move on to more review of precisely defining behaviors. In terms of research, a carefully defined behavior will be your dependent variable. A dependent variable is one that you measure in order to determine whether it is a function of your independent variable, to be discussed in later modules. A dependent variable in our field will almost always be a very precisely defined behavior. An independent variable will be a precisely defined manipulation of an environmental event, often an intervention. First, it's important to pinpoint a behavior rather than, for example, the results of a behavior. For example, instead of weight loss, one could target specific types, durations, or rates of exercises and/or food consumption. Or, instead of earning a specific grade, you could target methods and durations of studying, completion of homework assignments, arriving to class on time, etc. Some long-term goals, such as getting a job, improving self-esteem, etc., are so broad that they don't clearly implicate specific target behaviors. Note, however, that these outcomes could allow you to determine whether your intervention was successful to a socially significant degree. How could you work with a client to pinpoint target behaviors? Think about something big you want to accomplish. What are some specific behaviors that you could engage in to make that accomplishment more likely? Remember, from the assigned reading, behavior must be the activity of a living organism. A behavior must be something that you're able to observe and record, and thus must be able to be defined precisely and objectively. Essentially, a definition of behavior must pass the dead person's test. If a dead person could meet the standards of the definition, it's not usefully a behavior. Staying in one's seat, falling, keeping quiet during class, etc. are not behaviors. Cooper et al. State that a good definition of a target behavior provides an accurate, complete, and concise description of the behavior to be changed and therefore measured. Objective, clear, and complete. Each instance of the behavior must be able to be recorded reliably across observers, time, and environment. Only with a definition, and thus measurement, that can be agreed upon across observers can you justify the effectiveness of your interventions, or the need for intervention in the first place. Some of these phrases aren't elaborate enough to be fully complete and clear, but based on the requirements of including action or movement, impact on the environment, passing the dead person's test, and being objective, which of these phrases are usefully behaviors? Take a moment to consider each one. Note that in two cases, only part of the phrases are crossed out. Those parts assume intention or purpose that we can't objectively judge simply by observing the behavior. If you have questions about any of these, or wish to state the case for some being behaviors or not, please bring them up in class or online. This is a huge take-home point of this module. Clear, objective definitions are an absolute necessity to allow for accurate, reliable measurement across time and observers. An objective or operational definition is one that provides the opportunity to obtain complete information about the behavior's occurrence and non-occurrence. No assumptions, value judgments, or subjective terminology should be included in the definition. For example, what might be the problem with trying to record the rate at which the client is disruptive during class? This would be much too vague and inconsistent. One person might record data on the client making noise when the class is quiet, but others might record data when the client is talking to a peer even during breaks. An example of a more precise definition could be the rate at which a client claps their hands during class time when others are not doing so. So, we've talked about how to define a specific behavior, but to recap, applied behavior analytic interventions and research target socially significant behaviors. Socially significant behaviors are those that allow for habilitation. For example, language, social, motor, and academic skills that contact reinforcement and avoid punishment in the natural environment. How are those selected? Here we'll discuss pre-assessment considerations, assessment methods, and prioritization of some targets over others. The ethical codes will be covered in more detail in later courses, but bear reviewing right away. Before you even begin assessing any kind of behavior, consider your own competence as a behavior analyst. Do you know how to conduct the given assessment and analyze its results? Do you know what to do in case of an emergency when assessing a dangerous topography of behavior? Also keep in mind that you must obtain consent to conduct any type of assessment. A first stage of determining what behavior to intervene upon is determining what behaviors the client deems important and appropriate for you to assess and intervene upon. Behavior-analytic assessment relies upon observation and/or description of specific target behaviors. Results are classified based on how the individual thrives or struggles in their own personal environment. As such, behavior-analytic assessment must include reference to the environment as well as the behavior itself. These are examples provided by Cooper, Heron, and Heward in applied behavior analysis. We'll be covering assessment in much more detail in future courses, but for now, bear in mind that we can only create a function-based intervention for a given target behavior if we know what environmental events are functionally related to that behavior. So, we must define those environmental events occurring before and after behavior very precisely and objectively, in the same way that we operationally define the target behavior itself. Here's an example of the precision necessary in a behavior analytic assessment. If you were to be told that a client could say 10 different words, this would be insufficient information. First, of course, what specific words has the client emitted? At what rate and how often? In what environments, and in the presence of which people? Is the topography such that others can differentiate between the pronunciations, or can only close family members understand them? And finally, what functions do the words serve? What environmental events appear to be evoking and maintaining them? For example, is water only said in the presence of a glass of water, or when another person prompts, say water, or following a period of water deprivation or consumption of salty foods? There's a lot to consider. Now, more on deciding which behaviors to assess and ultimately intervene upon. First and foremost, we must consider habilitation, the degree to which the person's repertoire maximizes short and long-term reinforcers for that individual and for others, and minimizes short and long-term punishers. Aside from the fact that this is clearly in the client's best interest, if a target behavior is selected based on likely contribution to habilitation, it's more likely that it will ultimately be maintained in the individual's natural environment. Cooper, Heron, and Heward provide a great list of questions to consider when identifying appropriate target behaviors, and we'll be practicing with these questions in class. These questions are about target behaviors that we would want to increase in rate. An answer of yes to any of these questions would help you in determining that the behavior you're asking about is appropriate to assess and intervene upon. Consider a potential target behavior, threading beads onto a cord. Let's pretend that we're working with a 3-year-old client who will be starting preschool within the next year. Is this behavior likely to produce reinforcement in the client's natural environment after the intervention ends? Is this behavior a necessary prerequisite for a more complex and functional skill? Will this behavior increase the client's access to environments in which other important behaviors can be acquired and used? Will changing this behavior predispose others to interact with the client in a more appropriate and supportive manner? Is this behavior a pivotal behavior or behavioral cusp? Is this an age-appropriate behavior? Is this behavior adaptive and functional? Again, Figure 3.4 and Chapter 3 of Applied Behavior Analysis focuses primarily on assessment of habilitation of behaviors targeted for increase. Here, consider how you could use the full questionnaire to assess a behavior that you might target for decrease. How about the behavior of motor stereotypy in the form of a high school student in a typical classroom rocking back and forth? Is reduction of this behavior likely to lead to a greater degree of reinforcement in the client's natural environment after the intervention ends? Is this behavior interfering with development of prerequisites for more complex and functional skills? Will reduction in this behavior increase the client's access to environments in which other important behaviors can be acquired and used? Will changing this behavior predispose others to interact with the client in a more appropriate and supportive manner? Is this behavior competing with a pivotal behavior or behavioral cusp? Is this an age-appropriate behavior? If this behavior is to be reduced or eliminated from the client's repertoire, has an adaptive and functional behavior been selected to replace it? Based on client input, input from their significant others, and value to habilitation, you may still determine that numerous targets would be worth intervening upon. How then can you decide how to optimally spend your time with your client? Cooper, Heron, and Heward again provide a great list of questions to consider when answering this question. It's an excellent resource to return to time and time again in your career as a behavior analyst. Just as we must clearly define both behaviors and environmental events associated with them, the desired outcome of an intervention must also be objectively defined. You might come up with a goal based on the performance of someone who is an expert at engaging in the target behavior, or based on a level of performance that will produce the best results in the client's natural environment. An outcome must be socially valid, just as the target behavior should be selected in part based on its social validity. A goal should be defined based on the target behavior that you want to occur or to be eliminated, the conditions under which the behavior is expected to occur or change, and the mastery criteria, the desired effects of the behavior on the environment. We practiced pinpointing behavior earlier in this module. A first step of developing an intervention goal is to define the target behavior or actions. What exactly do you want your learner to do? These suggestions are from the book Preparing Instructional Objectives, published by Mager in 2004. Next, you should clarify the conditions under which the target behavior is expected to occur. Again, these examples are provided in Mager's text. For your goal of typing terms, the conditions under which you'll be engaging in that behavior are when you're shown definitions one by one in an online application for 1 minute. You might also clarify that you are to type the terms from memory, not referencing any other sources. Finally, the mastery criteria for the goal. What should the effects of the target behavior be? How well must the behavior be performed? Going back to the flashcards goal again, in this course you'll need to type at least 10 correct terms with no more than 2 errors. Defining a goal so precisely like this is important because otherwise you'll have no idea if the goal has been met. When we intervene upon a behavior, we must monitor progress so that we can change the intervention if the goal isn't being mastered. On the other side of that coin, when the goal is mastered, we should move on, not just keep drilling the same intervention. Here are some examples of goals from Mager's text. Let's look at the one on the top left. Without memory aids or other assistance, demonstrate a knowledge of the rules of grammar. This includes good conditions, without memory aids or other assistance, but does not clearly state an objective target behavior or outcome. How about the second goal? It includes one of the 3 components, but not the other 2. Which component is included? The third goal includes all components of a good goal: conditions, using any reference materials, behavior, name, and outcomes, every item out of 20 correctly. Take a moment to practice with these. You'll see the answers on the next slide. Take a moment to pause the video and review the performance, conditions, and criteria, or lack thereof, for each objective. In the answer key, the target behaviors are circled, the conditions under which the behavior should occur are underlined, and the mastery criteria are in italics. We'll talk about this a bit more in Module 3, but it's a relevant component of your flashcards goal to type terms matching definitions. Fluency is defined by the combination of speed and accuracy, and is often measured based on celeration, change in rate over time. We'll get to that next module. Fluency is important because accurate behavior may not occur at a rate high enough to allow for integration of component skills into composite skills, and behavior that is merely fast may not be sufficiently accurate. For example, if a person can draw numerical digits with perfect accuracy, but at a rate of only 10 per minute, they won't be able to meet academic standards of, for example, writing the answer to 60 single-digit addition problems per minute. On the other hand, a person may be able to write digits as the answer to those 60 math problems per minute, but they may either be inaccurate or illegible. Fluency is also defined in part on the long-term effects of that fast and accurate behavior, such as retention and maintenance. we have a lot of great evidence that students who are able to meet the fluency goal regarding accurate typing of terms matching important definitions perform better on exams and other assessments, and also retain what they've learned throughout other courses. Now, a quick overview of how you'll be specifically asked to work toward meeting your fluency goal. The SAFMEDS procedure. SAFMEDS is a common method of studying flashcards used within the paradigm of precision teaching, which we'll touch upon in Module 3. We say each term or definition out loud, rather than simply looking at the cards or saying them to ourselves, because that's the behavior that will ultimately be tested both in class and during application in the real world. Since your professors can't easily observe your behavior of saying the words out loud on a regular basis, the topography of behavior will be typing during this course. So I suppose we're using the TAFMEDS procedure. All flashcards are practiced during each session rather than batches, because you will again ultimately be tested on your fluency with each term and definition. You may find some terms more complicated than others, so sometimes your rate of typing will be slower if you run into a bunch of those more difficult cards. But it's important to build up your fluency with all of the terms that will be relevant to you as a behavior analyst. When practicing, you're asked to go as fast as you can during timings, since fluency is, again, a function of both accuracy and speed. It's typical to practice during 1-minute timings so that you don't strain your endurance too much initially. However, you'll also have the option to time yourself typing the terms matching all of the definitions in the deck. A minimum of 1 timing each day should be conducted to allow for repeated practice over time. You'll be scored based on practicing at least 3 times per week, but there is a lot of empirical evidence showing that more is better. Finally, the cards should be shuffled during each timing so that responding comes under the control of the actual terms and definitions rather than simply their order in a deck. Practicing online, this will be done for you automatically. Review the instructions for how to start practicing in Module 1's Activities and Assignments page on D2L.